What's going on, guys? Zed here, bringing you another Marvel Midnight Suns video. And this one is basically going to be just kind of my review of Storm as a character, but I am going to make another tier list soon. But this one's going to be discussing the Storm build or builds and how I think you should play her, sort of give my take on it, and where she fits into the metagame and all that. And yeah, really not much to it. I'll say that, again, this is, I think, another one of the builds that is completely mod like independent. It doesn't matter what mods you get. It does not matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And I'm going to say it again. It literally doesn't matter what mods you get. This is what I would run. This is the case for most characters in the game. Sometimes if you get quick on cards, that can change the dynamic, or sometimes if you get, on KO gain strengthened, sure, then you wouldn't want to run cards like Overload, right? But as you can probably see on the screen, there's no Overload, so we're not going to be discussing Overload uh, in the deck. So uh, let's talk about Storm. I'll give you sort of my feedback on her, and then we'll go from there. As a sort of reference point reminder, this document I'm using is my vanilla game deck list. Again, even though I do play on the balance mod, I still have vanilla deck lists for those who are maybe on console or don't care for the balance mod. It's totally fine. I have updated it as of today. I made small tweaks and changes, so a link to this will be in the description. And yeah, Storm obviously has had no changes on balance mod at the time of this video. And the last thing I want to say is, again, at the time of this video, there are two problems with the game that do affect Storm's power level. Number one is there's an interaction right now, at least for PC, where if an enemy has marked and you like knock them into an ally to kill them, the mark does not proc, therefore not refunding you card play. So that does nerf cards like Vortex slightly, but that is a universal issue, not just a Storm issue. But I want to point that out. The other thing, and the more important one, is Hellstorm. So Hellstorm, the damage is still working as intended, the next draw is working as intended, but the exhaust is not. Hellstorm is not properly exhausting from the hand or deck, and so technically you can just keep nuking people with it. So as once I found that out, I developed sort of a self-imposed rule where if I'm going to play Hellstorm, I need that to be sort of like the only time I play the card. Now, if that's earlier in the mission, obviously I'm going to draw into it again, and that might activate the next turn. But if there's a world where I can do, say, draw Hellstorm, before the next turn activates, redraw it. I've been doing that. Again, like, it's kind of dumb. It's a bit of a self-imposed rule, but just to try to really just use it as intended. I just want to make this clear because the exhaust not functioning on a card like Hellstorm is a really big deal. But I'm going to talk more about the card when we get there. So without further ado, let's talk about it. So Storm, where does she fit? Well, I think Storm is better played as sort of like if you picked her as a support role rather than a strict carry. That said, she can kind of go either direction. I don't think hybridizing her build is the way to go. And just as sort of a card review, I think the only cards you don't really want to see or use are Overload, Call the Lightning, and Crushing Blow. Now, the reason why is Overload, I mean, most people look at that card, you can probably tell what's wrong with it, right? The active effect just being a stun in an AoE conduit, super shit, right? And the upgrade increase size doesn't matter at all. Now, on redraw gain strengthen, well, that's really good. The problem is it's not worth a card slot, especially when you have cards like Livewire. I'm going to talk about Livewire when we get there. So Overload's not great. Crushing Blow, it's nice in the common deck. It's sort of like a Hellstorm. It's a wannabe Hellstorm. Once you get Hellstorm, just remove Crushing Blow for Hellstorm. And that's even more true because the exhaust isn't working. But Crushing Blow, not a bad card. I just think it's a little outclassed by Hellstorm, which makes total sense, right? It's a common to a legendary. So it's totally reasonable to to have that be the case. So that's fine. That's okay. And then the last one being Call the Lightning. Call the Lightning by itself isn't very good. Yes, it's a 250% offense AoE, which is one of the highest in the game, but unless you have Overload and Livewire or two Livewires live in your hand, Call the Lightning is pretty not great. It's very expensive. It doesn't really fit in the deck too. Like if you look at this, if you want to put Call of the Lightning in this deck, and this is true for Crushing Blow too. If you want Crushing or Call of the Lightning in this deck, you're going to have to run 4 heroics. Now you could do that. You could cut one of the attack cards for a 4th heroic, but I'm not really a believer in 4 heroic decks. I think that's just a really bad idea, especially when you consider what were they called? The hero combos, right? How it just adds an innate 4 heroism cost times 2 to your deck. So I always just as a hard rule cap myself at 3 heroics. So really you can't fit Call the Lightning and Crushing Blow. And that's honestly the main problem with those cards. They're not horrible and they would fit, like Call the Lightning fits pretty well with Storm. I tried it in place of Hellstorm just for testing purposes. But when it comes down to selecting the cards, there's no room for Crushing Blow or Call the Lightning, and Overload is just bad because Livewire exists. Okay, so those 3 cards, Overload, Crushing Blow, and Call the Lightning, are no. Like you probably don't want to be using those, whether you're support or DPS. It doesn't matter. I wouldn't use them. Again, Crushing Blow, just replace it eventually with Hellstorm once you get it. Otherwise, Crushing Blow is great. It's not bad. It's just yeah. So that's sort of the card review. Everything else is good, right? Like Vortex, Gale Force, Goddess Blessing, Storm Shield, Livewire, Hellstorm, and then Arc is. We'll talk about Arc, but those 7 cards are okay. So the deck. I'm going to talk about everything but the Vortexes first, because those are the 2 flex pieces. I believe that these 6 cards, um, Gale Force, Goddess's Blessing, Storm Shield, Livewire times 2, and Hellstorm, I think these 6 are non-negotiable. I have tried every version of Storm's build. I've tried it all. I've tried it as DPS, I've tried it as support, I've tried it with different comps, I've tried it on U3, New Game Plus, like I've tried it modless, like it feels this version of Storm with these 6 cards is so much better than any other iteration. It's so much better. So trust me, if like unless you're to the point where you're like, oh, I don't need Storm Shield, I literally don't need defensive cards. Well, okay, sure, dude. Then get rid of Storm Shield. Fine. Run like a second Goddesses, or maybe run an Overload for a redraw or a 4th attack. Fine. So Storm Shield can be flexed if you're like true end game, all items, all mods, min maxed. If you don't need the resist on Storm Shield, then don't run Storm Shield. That should be obvious, okay? But for most players, this is what I would do. Now, so Gale Force, pretty good card, right? Forceful knockback, quick, targeted. It's like Lash, kind of, though not quite as good. It's a good card. There's not much to say. Goddess's Blessing. I want you to think of Goddess's Blessing as Storm's Leave It to Me. For Iron Man, Leave It to Me is it's a very important card to Iron Man's kit, right? Pretty much the character just kind of sucks without Leave It to Me. It's so ingrained in his kit. It gives him the draws, which draw into Iron Man cards. It gives him the redraws to activate his passive and precision, Hellfire, etc., etc. So I want you to think of Goddess's Blessing in that way. Unupgraded, it's incredibly underwhelming, but upgraded, it's quite good. Storm Shield, really overstated card, really overtuned. It puts Shield of the Seraphim to shame, especially on vanilla. It's apply 2 resist and 1 counter to all allies. That's allies, meaning the other heroes, not Storm herself. So there is some balance in that respect. And then while in hand, she gains resist. And that also includes when you draw the card too, if you've noticed. So if you get like the Hellstorm proc for draw cards, where you play Goddess's Blessing, you will always gain that 1 resist from Storm Shield. So that's a pretty nice touch. And it also makes it good redraw fodder, which is why I'm saying if you replace the Storm Shield with Overload with the intent of redrawing it, that's not a stretch. It would work fine. Really good. Not much to say about it. If you don't think Storm Shield's really overtuned, then there's a bigger discussion there, because it is. Now, Livewire. Okay, so Livewire is a 1 heroism cost apply stun, upgraded effect while in hand, Storm gains offense. There's a few things I want to talk about with this card. Number 1, Note that the offensive coefficient of Livewire's buff is 50%. Okay? So, if you look at this screenshot, I just pulled this off the wiki. If you look at this screenshot, this version of Storm, her offense was somewhere in the realm of 116, give or take. It does round up, so it's possible that hers was 117, but anyway, 116. Okay, so 50% offense on live wire. Now, the way it works, I'm going to try to explain this clearly because it was a source of confusion on one of my recent streams. It gives Storm the offense. It does not give the cards offense. Now, there's a big, big difference. That being, talk about Arc for just a second. So, Arc is a 50% offense chain card, right? Meaning that each hit of the chain is 50% of Storm's offense. One way to interpret Livewire is while in hand, Storm gains 50% offense. One way to interpret that is now Arc does 100% rather than 50. That's not the case. It now does 50% of the new coefficient. So when you do the math and you break it down, instead of Arc doing 50% offense, it's only doing 75% offense, which is good, but I just want to make that clear. A single live wire in your hand does not make Arc do a total of 400% damage. It makes it do a total of 300% damage. Okay? And you can look at your own Storm, you can check the numbers yourself, but just take my word for it. It buffs Livewire buffs Storm, not Storm's cards. Now, the difference between say Livewire and Strengthen 2 is it's interesting, or rather Livewire and Blessing of the Vishanti maybe is a better comparison. Blessing of the Vishanti buffs the cards. Livewire buffs Storm. Okay, so if you want to see in game the difference between the interactions, look at those two cards. Okay. Now the thing is, Livewire stacks. So if it gives 50% offense to Storm, the second one, it's not like a reduced value. No, it's it's additive, so it's 100%. So when you're running two live wires, Arc is now doing, 400% offense. Your Vortex and Gale Force are hitting pretty hard now because it's upping Storm's coefficient, which is what knockbacks and forceful knockbacks are based off of. One live wire with Hellstorm in hand is big, but two live wires with Hellstorm in hand is broken. Because Hellstorm, transition to that, Hellstorm is 150 offense base coefficient, and the effect is also 150%, which is good, but keep in mind that it's 150% of Storm's offense. So if you're buffing Storm's offense by two live wires, by having them in hand, which benefits Hellstorm anyway, you're now basically like, I mean, in my last playthrough or my last stream, I was doing the DLC missions with only like two live wires, Hellstorm, and one other Storm card, so four Storm cards in hand, but two of which were live wire. I was overcapping one-shotting Dracula and Sin and like even like Dread Maidens, Guardians. It's absurd. It goes like Hellstorm goes from being a decent card, a great draw source of draw rather, to being just absurd with two live wires in hand, which it kind of shadows the rest of Storm's kit, but it is what it is. Now, Hellstorm, again, even if the exhaust was working as intended, it's still a strong card because the next turn effect to draw three Storm cards, that is repeatable, meaning you draw Hellstorm, the next turn activates, that's gone. If you redraw Hellstorm, it'll do it again. Now, that might also be a bug, but I don't think so. I think, given how all her next turn stuff works, it resets. I think that Hellstorm is a constantly repeatable card until you finally play it. Again, assuming it was working as intended. So, yeah, the damage on Hellstorm just gets ridiculously exponential the more live wires you have in your hand. Okay? Now, that's not to say that this version of the build is all eggs on Hellstorm, because it's not. So, to come back to the beginning where I skipped Vortex, I think Vortex is a really good card. I think so many mods are great on Vortex. If you get increased damage, giving it a base damage coefficient, that's broken with Livewire. Apply debuff of any kind, really good. Or, chance to marked, pretty good, right? All these things, they're nice to have. Vortex, I like because it just gives you that flexibility. Again, this is more of like that pseudo support storm version. So you've got knockbacks every which way, and then in an AoE forceful knockback, it's like a mini Blade Storm. But then when you have two live wires in your hand, it is Blade Storm, uh, which is crazy. So that's a thing. It's really good. Vortex can feel like ass without live wire and without like damage on it, but I wanna like restate how important Livewire is to this character. If you haven't been running it in your decks, or you've only been like running one in your decks, I implore you to try, even if you don't like the build that I have, just try running two Livewires. Seriously. Like it it completely changes the character, or at the very least, run one Livewire and one Overload if you really are iffy on having two cards stuck in your hand. It is absurd how exponential this character gets with Hellstorm and how ridiculous her shoves and knockbacks are with double live wire. With one, it's like okay, like it's good, but it's the same as a Ravenous or a Hulk, right? Not really crazy. But two is absurd. Like it's ridiculous. She rivals Hulk's 5 rage damage. That's insane. So Arc, touching back on Arc, if you're going to play DPS Storm, I would still run this exact build, but I would replace two Vortexes with two Arcs. Why? Well, because Arc now gains all that extra damage from Livewire, like I was saying, and you don't really care about the utility of the knockbacks. You do still have Gale Force, you still have your shoves, but now Arc is basically like twice as strong as Wild Strike almost. 400% offense on one card, even if you're just doing chain 4 on one target, that is absurd amounts of damage on one target. Okay, like that's unprecedented levels of damage. Like you think Wild Strike does a lot of damage, it's only 250. So, double live wire chain is double live wire arc is absurd. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how the build works, but that's pretty much it. That's how I would play the character. That's my thoughts on the character, but a little bit about the nuance of the build and why I've kind of chosen why one goddesses, why one storm shield, why one gale, etc. So, and this doesn't matter if you're running Vortex or Arc. So everything I say from now on is universal to what I have on the screen right now. Okay. Let's talk about Goddess's Blessing first. So Goddess's Blessing reads: draw two storm cards, activate next turn on all storm cards in your hand. So that's an important distinction. Activate next turn on all cards in your hand, while also drawing two cards. So let's look at the synergies, right? You have two vortexes or arcs, both have an next turn effect. Okay, so that's two cards in your deck that benefit. Gale Force, unfortunately, does not benefit from Goddess's Blessing, so that is a little bit of missed value. This is why I wouldn't run two Gale Force, because Goddess's Blessing into two Gale Force is very clunky, it's not that good, doesn't feel great. Storm Shield, that's three. You gain that resist the moment you draw it. Yes, it doesn't have a next turn, but once drawn, it gets a benefit. Both copies of Livewire. Okay, again, no next turn, but now you have that Livewire offensive coefficient adding to everything Storm's going to do. And then obviously Hellstorm benefits. So that's 6 cards. So Goddess's Blessing itself obviously doesn't benefit from Goddess's Blessing. And then Gale Force. And that's it. All 6 other cards in the deck benefit from Goddess's Blessing. There's just a lot of value there. I wouldn't run two Goddess's Blessing because I find that very, very clunky, very unnecessary. You don't really want to ever spend that many card plays that often on it. There's no need. And then, like I said, two Gale Force feels unnecessary. If you don't want to run two Vortex and you want to do like one Arc, one Vortex, you could try that. I just think that more often than not, you wouldn't really want to see the Arc or you wouldn't want to see the Vortex. I think it's better to just sort of all in. But you could try one on one and see what you think. I didn't care for it myself. Storm Shield at 2, again, very excessive, very clunky. If your logic is, well, if I have 2 in hand, then she gains double resist. It's like, well, is Storm really taking that much aggro? I don't think so. I highly doubt it. So 1 is fine, and then if you redraw it, great, you got a free resist. If you don't, and you play it, great. That's a net 5 resist and 2 counter to, like, if you're totaling what you're paying for. One card play of Storm Shield is +2 heroism, +5 resist, and +2 counter. That is so much value out of one card play. That's why one Storm Shield is fine, two is excessive. Livewire, again, the stun is nice to have, not need to have. I haven't even talked about Storm's passive because it's take it or leave it. You can't really play around it, but it's nice to have. So the stun is great against obviously frenzied enemies or boss fights, but if there's no boss and no frenzy, not great. So you're of course running it for the well in hand. So what you could do with this, right, is if you think, oh, I don't want these dead cards in my hand, so here's what you do. You once you have live wire in your hand, play your turn out if as best you can, or just use one of your two redraws. Then before your turn is over, redraw that dead live wire for another tool to start the next turn if you want to kind of play it that way. Or do your storm turn, have one redraw and one card play left, redraw that live wire, and then see what happens, right? If you're worried about the clunkiness, but honestly, as someone who does worry about clunkiness and bricky hands, Livewire does not feel like a brick because of how Storm functions. And then, yeah, Hellstorm is just a great card. Even if it was working fully as intended, excuse me, it's just a great card. It does a ton of damage, way too much for 3 heroism, in my opinion. And then the draw factor is insane. Even if you only ever redrew it and used it for the draw power, it's insane. And using Hellstorm in that way definitely benefits Arc more than Vortex. Because if you're running this build but your Hellstorm is your draw power, you would really have no damage. So again, this is more support Storm that you see on the screen with that nuke power of Hellstorm. But it also is, if you replaced Vortexes with Arcs, it's a very strong DPS build, and Hellstorm can just constantly draw into arcs. Again, because of how draw works, once all Storm's cards have been used out of the deck, they all get reshuffled, so you could technically see 3 arcs in one turn. Technically. But that's neither here nor there. Different conversation, different video, different understanding of deck mechanics, etc. That's all I got for you. That's Storm. That's how I would build her. I've seen some whack builds like 2 Vortex, 2 Gale Force, 2 Goddess Blessing. I'm like, what are you doing? I've seen people not running Overload or Livewire. What the hell are you doing? Like, I don't know, man. I think people's builds for Storm are whack as hell. But this is what I got for you. Again, mods aside, I do use mods, but I don't build my decks around them when I'm showcasing them to you guys. And so, yeah, I think you could run whatever you want. I think a lot of the mods are good for Storm. It's a good feature of the character. I think she sits at about, if Hellstorm was working as intended, I think Storm sits at, I'd say high mid tier. So not S tier, but somewhere in the A tier, kind of where I put Iron Man. Similar reasons. But yeah, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you want a link to all these vanilla deck lists, it will be in the description, amongst other things that are noteworthy. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace for now.